Forget horned helmets and Hollywood myths. Real Viking survival was raw, brutal, and brilliant. When winter closed in and food grew scarce, Viking hunters didn't just rely on brute strength, they relied on brainpower. Every tool they used was born out of necessity, crafted to track, trap, and take down prey in some of the harshest conditions on Earth. They weren't just swinging axes at everything that moved. These people had tools for precision, for stealth, for survival. And what's wild? Some of those tools were so well designed, they still show up in modern bushcraft and survival gear today. So whether you're into Viking history, off-grid living, or just fascinated by old-school innovation that still works, this one's for you. Let's break down 7 Viking hunting tools that were way more advanced than you think, and might just make you rethink what ancient survival really looked like. Atlottle, spear thrower. Before the bow and arrow dominated hunting, there was the atlatl. And yes, the Vikings knew how to use it. This clever tool wasn't a weapon itself, but a force multiplier. Think of it like a lever for your arm. The atlatl let hunters throw a spear much farther and with way more force than by hand alone, up to 90 miles per hour in some cases. It worked by cradling a spear in a grooved stick with a hook at the end. When the user whipped it forward, the atlatl added leverage and whip-like acceleration to the throw. The result? Devastating impact from a safe distance. And when you're stalking elk or defending your meal from a predator, staying out of harm's way is a big deal. Atlatls were especially useful in open terrain or near water, where a missed shot could be recovered. Vikings likely used them during hunts in icy plains or forest edges where large prey like reindeer or moose roamed. Today, survivalists and primitive weapon enthusiasts still use atlatls to hunt. Some states in the US even allow it legally. You can make one from a carved branch and a straight hardwood spear with a fletched tail. It's proof that even before high-tech gear, simple physics and good craftsmanship could put dinner on the table. SelfBows, yew or elm. Long before compound bows and carbon arrows, the Vikings had their own version of ranged precision, the SelfBow. Made from a single piece of flexible wood, often yew, elm, or ash, these bows were reliable, deadly, and surprisingly elegant in their simplicity. The SelfBow wasn't massive like the English longbow, but it packed enough punch to take down deer, boar, and even enemy raiders. Vikings valued these bows not just for hunting, but for defense and war. In fact, Norse sagas mention bows as often as they do swords and axes. A skilled archer could silently stalk prey through dense forests or perch above a clearing for hours, waiting for the right shot. What made the SelfBow so effective? It was fast to make, if you knew what you were doing, easy to carry, and quiet, perfect for a stealthy approach. Vikings typically paired them with birch or pine arrows tipped with bone, antler, or iron. Even today, SelfBows are a go-to choice for bushcrafters and primitive archers. With just a knife, a solid piece of wood, and some patience, you can carve your own. The bowstring? Viking-era hunters might have used twisted animal sinew or plant fiber. Modern versions often use rawhide or even paracord. Whether you're surviving off-grid or just appreciating old-world engineering, the Viking SelfBow proves that sometimes less really is more. Boar Spear with crossbar. Hunting a wild boar isn't like chasing a rabbit through the brush. It's more like picking a fight with a small tank that has knives for teeth. The Vikings knew this, and that's why they developed the boar spear, one of the most practical and life-saving tools in their hunting arsenal. The genius of the boar spear lies in the crossbar. This horizontal piece just behind the spearhead wasn't decorative. It served a very real purpose. When a spear struck a charging boar, the animal's momentum could drive it further down the shaft, bringing it dangerously close to the hunter. The crossbar stopped that from happening. It literally kept a furious, impaled boar from goring you on its way out. Made from ash or another strong wood, the shaft needed to be sturdy but flexible enough not to snap under pressure. The spearhead itself was often forged from iron and designed to penetrate thick hide and muscle, while the crossbar was either built into the design or lashed on tightly with rawhide or iron clamps. Modern hunters might not be skewering wild boars in snowy forests, but the principle lives on in survival spears, safety stoppers, and controlled depth hunting tools. Some bushcrafters even replicate the boar spear using a sharpened metal point lashed to a thick branch, crossbar included. It's a reminder that the Vikings weren't just warriors, they were problem solvers. And in this case, they solved the problem of What happens when your dinner fights back? Throwing axe, Francisca style. To most people, an axe is for chopping wood. But to the Vikings, it was also a hunting tool, and in some cases, a flying one. Enter the Francisca-style throwing axe, a compact curved weapon that wasn't just for battlefields. It also played a role in hunting. The Francisca wasn't some massive double-bladed fantasy axe. It was light, well-balanced, and perfectly shaped for flight. The head had a wide blade and a distinct curve, designed to rotate in the air and hit edge first, making it deadly when thrown properly. Vikings could carry a few tucked in their belts, and with enough practice, they could hurl one with surprising accuracy into small prey, or even at birds startled into flight. For hunting, it was a tool of opportunity. If you spotted a hare darting across the snow or a bird perched on a branch, a quick toss of the Francisca could bring dinner down in an instant. Its portability also made it ideal for long-distance treks. No bulky bows or heavy javelins needed, just an axe that could chop firewood, build a shelter, and double as a ranged weapon. Today, throwing axes are popular again, for sport, survival, and even self-defense. You'll find modern versions in many bushcraft kits, and survivalists train with them for scenarios where ammunition runs out or silence is key. But the Viking Francisca still stands out as one of the earliest and smartest multi-use tools. It's not just a weapon, it's a survivalist's dream. Fishing spears and harpoons. The icy waters of the North Atlantic weren't forgiving, but the Vikings knew how to fish like their lives depended on it, because they often did. When nets weren't practical and baited lines were too slow, they relied on a more direct, skillful method: the fishing spear or harpoon. These weren't crude sticks with sharp ends. Viking fishing spears often featured multiple prongs, usually 3 to 5, that curved inward slightly to trap fish more effectively once struck. The tips were made of sharpened bone, antler, or metal, and were barbed to prevent escape. Attached to a long wooden shaft, these spears allowed a Viking to stand on a rock or boat, peering into the water, and strike with lightning-fast precision. Harpoons, a variation used especially for larger fish and sea mammals, had detachable heads attached to rope. Once the harpoon hit its target, the head lodged in, and the rope allowed the Viking to haul it in, a method still used in some traditional whale hunting today. To pull this off, you needed patience, timing, and a good eye. Imagine standing still for hours in freezing winds, waiting for the right moment to strike a moving target in dark water. But when food supplies were low, this skill could mean the difference between eating and starving. Today, modern versions of this technique still exist, especially among indigenous Arctic communities and survivalists practicing spearfishing. The gear has changed, but the principle remains the same: human instinct meeting nature with nothing but a sharpened spear and steady hands. It's a survival method as raw and real as it gets, and one the Vikings perfected. Pitfall traps with camouflage. Vikings weren't just fierce warriors, they were clever hunters. When chasing game wasn't an option, they let the ground do the work. Pitfall traps were one of the most low-tech yet brutally effective tools in their survival toolkit, especially for catching large animals like deer, boar, or even wolves. The idea was simple: dig a deep, narrow hole along an animal trail, line it with sharpened stakes, or leave it empty, and then disguise the surface with branches, moss, and loose soil. The animal, unaware of the danger, would step onto the trap and fall in, injured or unable to escape. Sometimes bait was placed nearby to lure them in faster. Vikings understood how animals moved through the forest. They studied patterns, wind direction, and even animal behavior to decide where and when to dig. And once the trap was set, they waited. Unlike active hunting, pitfall traps allowed a single person to hunt multiple animals passively, especially useful during long winters or when manpower was limited. Modern versions of this concept still exist in bushcraft and wilderness survival, though often less lethal and more focused on capture than kill. If you're ever in a true survival situation, knowing how to dig a well-placed trap, especially for larger prey, can dramatically increase your odds of getting food without burning energy in long chases. In an age without GPS, thermal scopes, or rifles, pitfall traps were the original set-it-and-forget-it hunting strategy. And when done right, they worked like a charm, giving the Vikings one more edge against starvation. Snare loops, cordage snares. Sometimes the best hunting tool doesn't need a sharp edge or brute strength, just a loop of cord and a bit of patience. Viking hunters understood this well. When they weren't chasing wild boar or fishing in icy rivers, they were setting snare loops, simple traps made from twisted animal sinew, leather thongs, or plant fibers. These snares were strategically placed along animal trails, near burrows, or close to water sources. The loop would be propped open with a trigger mechanism, and when a rabbit, bird, or other small animal passed through, the snare would tighten instantly, trapping it by the neck or leg. No noise, no commotion, just efficient hunting while you slept or worked elsewhere. Snare loops were lightweight, easy to carry, and perfect for catching small game during the lean months. Vikings would set several at once, maximizing their chances of catching dinner without spending hours on the move. The technique wasn't just about survival, it was about multiplying effort with minimal energy, a core principle in any good survival strategy. Modern survivalists and bushcrafters still rely on snares, especially in emergency kits. Knowing how to craft a basic snare using paracord or natural fibers is a timeless skill. It's quiet, passive, and still incredibly effective. The next time you think of Viking warriors, remember this: they weren't just brawny axe swingers. They were strategic, resourceful, and deeply tuned to nature, able to outwit it when needed. And a simple snare loop? That was one of their smartest weapons. For all their fearsome reputation, the Vikings weren't just raiders and warriors, they were survival experts. Living in a world of harsh winters, limited resources, and wild terrain meant that every tool had to serve a purpose, or several. These hunting tools weren't just clever, they were the reason families ate, furs were worn, and settlements thrived. What's even more impressive? Many of these tools still work today. From the atlatl's power to the quiet efficiency of a snare loop, modern bushcrafters and survivalists still rely on the same principles the Vikings mastered over 1,000 years ago. It just goes to show, you don't always need high-tech gear to survive. Sometimes, the smartest tools are the ones carved from wood, sharpened with stone, and tested by generations. So the next time you're out in nature or dreaming of living off the grid, remember, the Vikings did it first, and they did it well.